Well, hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Benjamin Rode. I'm a senior fellow at the ISS and the editor of the Adelphi book series. I'm delighted that you're able to join us for this launch of the latest book in the Adelphi series, which is Lawrence Freedman and Heather Williams, Changing the Narrative, Information Campaigns, Strategy and Crisis Escalation in the Digital Age, published last week. ISS members should already have received their copy. If you're not an ISS member, then firstly, I would suggest you consider applying to become one. And in the meantime, you can purchase the book from Amazon and also directly from Routledge. And participants in this webinar will receive by email a 20% discount code to purchase it from Routledge. And at the end of the webinar, the title screen will come up again with a QR code in case you find that more convenient. So first of all, I want to thank Laurie and Heather for this book and all the immense work they put into it. It's a delight to now finally see it in print, especially in this lovely new cover design. I want to thank all of the Institute's various teams whose hard work also made this possible, especially editorial design and communications, and a particular thanks to the assistant editor, Michael Marsden. Heather and Laurie will speak for about 10 minutes before we go into Q&A. Ahead of the Q&A, I just want to flag that questions will be taken by written submissions in the chat function in Zoom. So if you have questions already or questions that will come to mind during the discussions, please write them in the chat function there so I can see them. Yes, thank you. That's now being flagged by my technical colleague. So if you could please write your questions there, then I'll be able to read them out and pose them to the authors. So this book, described as narratives, provide the storylines of conflict, and in doing so become an arena of conflict themselves. When states mount information campaigns against each other, they're trying to change the narrative. The digital platforms of the new information environment have been identified by various analysts as a significant factor in contemporary strategy and crisis management. But while social media is noisier and more chaotic than traditional media and unprecedented in its immediacy and accessibility, has it thus far been a game changer in strategic affairs? And we will be hearing on that very question from our two authors, who I will now briefly introduce, although I'm sure neither of them need an introduction to most of you. So Sir Lawrence Freedman is Emeritus Professor of War Studies at King's College London, where he was Professor of War Studies from 1982 to 2014 and Vice Principal from 2003 to 2013. A Fellow of the British Academy, he has served as official historian of the Falklands Campaign and as a member of the official inquiry into Britain's role in the Iraq War. And Dr. Heather Williams is the director of the Project on Nuclear Issues and a senior fellow in the International Security Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C. She's also an associate fellow with the Project on Managing the Atom in the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs at the Harvard Kennedy School. And until last year, she was a senior lecturer in defense studies at King's College London. So Laurie, I believe, will speak first and then Heather. So Laurie, over to you.
Thanks, Ben. Well, it's good to be here. Good to see the book out. The question posed is whether the digital age is transforming strategic affairs. And perhaps the less than exciting conclusion is not as much as you might think. This isn't, as other books on this topic have been, a call to everybody to be alert to a rising danger, not because there isn't a problem and not because people don't need to be alert, but because it's important to keep a sense of proportion. And I think basically what this book is about is trying to keep a sense of proportion. And it has to be kept in mind that one of the reasons why information campaigns perhaps aren't always as effective as one might fear, in a negative sense, is because people are more aware of the problem and are more alert to the dangers. It's a very difficult thing to measure. And I think that's one of the problems that we addressed and why we use case studies to look into it more. And Heather will be talking more about the case studies that we adopted. It's one of those areas where you can certainly see the input, you can see the effort being made by various actors to change narratives. And this is, we're not just talking here about states. You can see it in pressure groups, in political movements, and so on. And you can understand why they find Facebook and Twitter and so on suitable as means of transmitting their ideas and creating, trying to create a new narrative. But for reasons I'll come on to, it's quite difficult for this always to be successful. So the issue is not whether or not there's an input. There's absolutely no doubt that considerable resources are put in to trying to shift opinions through these means, and that's not just social media, obviously, with broadcasting media, print media as well. And some states put a lot of deliberate effort into this, but the outputs are much harder to identify in terms of changed opinions and so on. I think just going back, we started this project some years ago when Heather was still at King's, looking at Trump's tweets, which seemed to be quite a novel phenomenon then, in that he was bypassing normal governmental processes in order to make rather outlandish comments at times, but which nonetheless had to be taken as authoritative statements of policy because they came from the President of the United States. And there were issues raised and questions asked about whether or not this might produce a new mode of international discourse, crisis management, in which the immediacy and urgency of this mode of communication might aggravate crises, or maybe in some cases calm them. Now, I think that's still an issue. In the end, it's not that easy to see why a tweet is that different, say, from an unscripted remark at a press conference. But they're still, they still may happen. Obviously, may happen again if Trump comes back to power. But it doesn't seem to be quite as pressing a concern as it did, partly because Trump isn't in power, and partly because the medium itself has become less reliable. And in a sense, this project didn't begin as Twitter reached its peak. It had probably reached its peak before that. But the last year or so, especially since Musk has taken over, have certainly seen a decline. And so one wonders whether that sort of international meeting place where people from a great range of countries could communicate with each other, sometimes abusively, but often perfectly cordially, may have had its day, not only because Musk has made the medium harder to deal with, but also because countries that didn't like its influence, such as China, Russia, Iran, have put up their own firewalls. So it just doesn't have the range of people involved. Nonetheless, the other issue that I think drives a lot of the book, which is the question of changing narratives, is still very much with us. And we can see daily examples of governments or supporters of governments trying to change the way we think about big issues, whether it's about COVID or at the moment, obviously, a lot is involved with Ukraine. So why are we skeptical that it makes so much of a difference? The reason is that actually our opinions are quite sticky. They're quite well embedded, and it takes a lot to shift them. By and large, we're not looking for evidence that we're wrong. We're looking for evidence to confirm what we believe. Now, this means, of course, that if you're reaching a friendly audience, then a good campaign can reinforce what people think. And one of the things that comes through from our research, which is not a surprise, is that these campaigns do work in reinforcing domestic opinion. They do make they provide reasons why people might trust the government or believe the government on controversial issues. But it's much more difficult for outsiders to change the views of another country and another society with different culture, different language, different expectations. If they're able to do so, if they're able to get some sort of way in, it's not because usually the cleverness of the campaigning, it's because the divisions are already there in that country, because they're picking up on themes which are already there. So when we look at things like the 2016 American presidential election campaign, the views about Hillary or the anger that Trump was picking up on, all of these you could find domestic sources for before anybody else came in. But it was possible for the resources and the direction of a malevolent actor to push them along. So it's not that there are no circumstances when it can make a difference, but you need pretty suitable circumstances before it works. I suppose the final point to make is that we're also very keen to stress the importance of the wider context in which these campaigns take place. I think that and the basic other factors of power that countries can wield. And I think that's for two reasons. The first is even if you've changed somebody's views, what flows from it? What difference does it make? I mean, we can see examples of shifts in opinion, but if a government is set on its ways, it may not make much difference. And one example, just to demonstrate the point, was that Russia could stop investigations at the UN into what had gone on in Syria and the use of chemical weapons and so on, or impede these investigations because of its power at the UN, not because it had better arguments or a clever campaign. The second is that events give credibility to the narrative. You can assert so much things that in practice can be shown to be fake or untrue or contrived or exaggerated. But when it hits people's actual lived experience, then it doesn't work so well. And one of the problems, I think, authoritarian regimes, which tend to be dependent on official narratives, I mean, we live in noisy, cacophonous states anyway, but for authoritarian states, is they fix on a narrative and it can get so strong that big events can dislodge it because there's an immediate loss of credibility. So I'll hand over to Heather, just sort of emphasizing the point. We're absolutely not suggesting that Russia and China and Iran and North Korea or whatever don't try to shift our opinion. They clearly put a lot of effort into doing so. What we're saying is we're allowed to be skeptical of how successful these campaigns are, at least in our societies. There are debates about how successful they are elsewhere, but I think the same point will hold. They'll be successful elsewhere if they've got an audience that is already tempted or sympathetic to those views. Over to Heather.
Great, thanks. Thanks so much, Laurie, and thanks so much to Ben and the whole double team for working with us on this project. So Laurie's really nicely covered, I think, the top level points from the book. And so I wanted to offer a few more granular details about the case studies and some of the other trends that we saw in the book. But just to say a little bit more, the impetus for this project, it goes pretty far back to Trump's election. And I did a study with one of our colleagues at King's, Jeff Michaels. I think I saw Jeff's name on the list. So Jeff, thanks for being part of the impetus of this kind of line of questioning. And Jeff and I in our study had looked at, what had Trump said before being elected about nuclear policy issues, And how would he be different than previous Republicans? And we had found that the real difference of Trump from other kind of Republican platforms on nuclear issues was his use of social media. And that really sparked a lot of questions about what is the impact of social media on nuclear policy, on crises, and that kind of spiraled into this bigger line of questioning that we kind of talked about to better understand the impact of social media more broadly. And so in the book, we look at 4 different cases. Those are the 2019 India-Pakistan crisis, the US-Iran crisis in very early 2020, China's information campaigns, disinformation campaigns around COVID-19, and then the Russia-Ukraine case study. When Lori and I first started this book, it was before the pandemic and before the invasion of Ukraine. And so the nature of the cases expanded a little bit as we went along. But I think that we captured it at a really important moment. So I'll just really quickly go through the 4 cases and a couple kind of interesting little breadcrumbs that we found that people might want to follow up on. So the India-Pakistan crisis, that was 2 weeks following a terrorist attack in Kashmir. And in the case study, we do focus more on India, but that's mainly because there's just a lot more social media use and activity in India than in Pakistan. But there are plenty of studies that have found both India and Pakistan have used social media and disinformation campaigns, that this was more just focusing on India for a variety of reasons. But one thing we found was that there was a very clearly coordinated social media campaign by the BJP as a party. Modi himself actually didn't comment all that often on the crisis on social media, but rather there was kind of this army of others that would do a lot of that work for the party. And it was pushing a very nationalist narrative. But to Lori's point, this was tapping into a pre-existing perspective. It didn't whip up nationalism out of nowhere. It was really feeding into some pretty hateful existing narratives that were already existing. And so that was where we drew a lot of that conclusion from. The second case study was US-Iran, that was following the assassination of Soleimani. And people probably well remember Trump's Twitter activity during this time. It was pretty colorful. In one of the more dangerous tweets, he had suggested targeting Iranian cultural sites in retaliation for any escalation. But interestingly, Iran also used social media during this time. And it's interesting because there's not a lot of social media platforms that are permitted in Iran. But we saw the Ayatollah took to Instagram and put up a picture of a handprint on Trump's face, suggesting that Trump would be smacked. That it was a kind of a warning shot when they retaliated. But what we also found was during this time, it was a traditional diplomatic channel that was really, that played a really important communication role during the crisis to de-escalate tensions, and that was the role of Switzerland. And so that was, again, finding social media didn't have this kind of game-changing effect that a lot of folks had feared it would. Third case study was China and disinformation around COVID-19. And this case study I thought was really fascinating because we were monitoring in real time a change in China's approach to information strategy and to diplomacy. This was when Chinese diplomacy, like wolf warrior diplomacy, but it really translated into social media as well. And so saw a lot of disinformation campaigns about the sources of COVID-19, China also targeting a lot of European partners. Italy got a lot of Chinese disinformation attention during this time. But we also saw China's campaign was pretty well coordinated. They would take advantage of opportunities like the WHO director saying, China has done so much for the world in being the first to try to combat COVID-19. And the Chinese information narrative campaign and narrative just picked right up on that and then amplified it. But so we saw China during this case, they really evolved in how they used social media, the information space, and digital resources. And then our last case study was Russia and Ukraine. And as I said, initially, this was just a 2014 case study, but it expanded to include the ongoing war. And a couple of points from this, just a flag, is that Russia takes a pretty different approach to social media from China. China was relatively disciplined, really focused messaging. Russia just floods the information space. Russia will just throw out a host of narratives. Some of them are consistent, like claiming that Ukraine is run by fascists, claims of Ukrainian dirty bomb work. But it really is just about sowing as much anarchy in the digital space as possible. So that's a really quick snapshot of the cases. But then just a couple final little trends that I wanted to kind of dangle out there for us to think about. One of them, comparing across the case studies, we can see how different actors are using digital information campaigns differently, right? So as I said, Russia is more about sowing confusion. They like to create a lot of noise. China is much more focused, more targeted. Iran seems to largely play a role of an amplifier. But an interesting trend that we also picked up on is that those three countries, I don't think that we have evidence to say that they were formally coordinating. Rather, they're opportunistic, and they will take advantage of each other's narratives and amplify each other's narratives. So there's a bit of collusion going on there between authoritarian regimes and how they're using these disinformation campaigns. And then another thing to flag, as we've said, the project has been going on for a while, and in that time, platforms change. From the start of the project, Trump was kicked off Twitter, Trump was let back on Twitter, Twitter changed its name, and arguably TikTok has become the much more prominent social media platform than Twitter X these days. And so we're just seeing a real rapid rate of change in how these disinformation campaigns are spread and the use of social media for them. The final point I think I'll flag, which we kind of hit on in the end of the Russia case study, but it is about how to combat disinformation in these campaigns. You know, as Laurie said, we shouldn't just say, we shouldn't be completely sanguine and passive about this. There is still a need to stay alert. And the way that the United States and some other NATO members shared intelligence in the lead up to Russia's invasion, the way that they've combated disinformation, I think should be an important area for follow-on studies to understand how effective those efforts have been. But I will stop there and turn it over to Ben. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Heather, and thank you to Laurie as well for those very concise and interesting kind of overviews. So far I see there are no open questions to me from the audience. So clearly this topic is open, shut, and closed and warrants no further discussion, and everyone is in complete agreement. But while I'm waiting for people perhaps to muster the courage to type some questions okay, we've got some now, but I'm still going to ask a question just because I already had it kind of queued up. So Heather and Laurie, I saw that, I think it was this week, or maybe it was last week, a former chief of the Secret Intelligence Service in England, so Alex Younger, said something which I think in one way will be music to your ears. He said, we should not panic about Russian election interference. And he said, I don't deny that it's a serious problem, but the wounds are homegrown. We should not panic about this. But the things that divide our society were made by us, and we have it in our power to solve those things. So that will probably, I imagine, very much, he would agree with your thesis in this book. However, he also added, he said, digital platforms should be legally required to, I'm paraphrasing, legally required to track the provenance of information in an aim to combat falsehoods created by artificial intelligence. And you may have seen also last week, the EU had a large pronouncement against Musk's Twitter as being this kind of, I'm again not quoting directly, a kind of cesspool of disinformation. And Facebook was also named there. And I mean, having waded into X, as it's now called recently, you can quite clearly see that Musk is kind of credulously reposting news sources that are fascist or semi-fascist to his hundreds of millions of followers. And although, I want to be clear to underscore that your argument is definitely not that we should be totally relaxed and this is nothing to worry about, I suppose I'd like to ask both of you if you could maybe riff for a few minutes on where this is going. If you were writing this book in 2 or 5 years from now, and AI and AI's enablement, let's put it like that, of disinformation, do you think that your conclusions are likely to need heavily revising, or are you not so concerned about that?
Well, so I start. Sorry, I did see those comments, and I thought, yep, that's with us. I think that there's a difference between, I don't think we really explore this, but there's one difference between Twitter and Facebook. People are on Facebook for all sorts of reasons, social and entertainment, family, whatever. You're on Twitter as a news medium or a shared opinion medium. I mean, the adverts are there, but it's not why you go there. And I think the risk for Musk is he'll kill off Twitter. So you've got to be on it to be influenced by it. And one of the things with Facebook is people were on it anyway. And I think the problem with Twitter stroke X at the moment, although I am still on it, is that it's you've got to wade your way through nonsense. Now, I think if you're experienced enough, it doesn't take, you don't have to be a genius to work out where some of the nonsense is coming from. But if you're not that familiar with it, then maybe you might get caught. But my guess is that its influence is on the wane. And I even wonder how long Musk will keep on playing with it, but we'll see. But it's far less effective. I mean, from benevolent as well as malevolent uses, I think now. Because there were good things that come out of social media. It's not a wholly negative story. And many people do feel a sense of loss that this form of communication is no longer as attractive. The AI issue, I think, is a big one, and it's very hard at the moment to judge. It's clear that there are forms of fakery now possible, or just distortions, if you like, that may influence the way these things operate. I still think there are issues of how you get your audience, how you make them notice, how what's being shown fits in with previous beliefs. So I don't think it's as simple as that. But if you want to smear somebody, it's clearly going to be that much easier, because you can create an image which shows somebody doing terrible things which they never did. And I think the ability to clamp down on that is going to be important. Knowing the provenance of where this comes from, I suspect, is going to be less useful, just simply because of the many ways in which stuff can be rooted. So I think you might get into large complications to achieve very little. But I think there is a lot to be said at schools and so on, which I know happens to a degree already. There's just ensuring kids do know how to use social media intelligently and read it, often for reasons nothing to do with what we're talking about, but for all the other reasons we know social media can be harmful as well as good.
Thank you, Laurie. Heather, do you have anything you'd like to chime in about that?
Yeah, just a few points. And this is a bit more informed by a U.S. perspective, and since moving back here, the message from the British report, don't panic but be vigilant, that certainly resonated with our findings. And I do think a lot of the political turmoil, those are the seeds that we've sown. It's still really messy and it's still really ugly, and I would rather not see it get amplified as much as it does. Particularly in the US at the moment, we're in a pretty unprecedented political crisis, and seeing some of the, frankly, garbage on social media from both sides, it isn't like one side is guiltless in all of this. That social media, it does play an amplification role more so than a creation role. It's still, a lot of these are things I would rather not see amplified. And so I think that's where the vigilance is really important. But ultimately it will have to be about getting down to the roots of what are the real issues that are being amplified here. Just very quickly on AI, I think an important observation has been that AI companies are calling for governance. They are calling on government to say, regulate us. Let's come up with some guardrails for this technology. I don't hear any social media company saying that. And they're very different beasts. I understand that, but I think that we can do a lot better in listening to the AI companies and working with industry, like kind of bridging the policy and the technical and industry communities to understand what would be the type of AI governance that would be most useful particularly on places like on platforms like social media. So in 5 years, will our findings still hold? What will the landscape look like? I think that we need a pretty big we need a bigger digital literacy campaign over those next 5 years to maintain that vigilance and to prevent any sort of worsening and escalation. So in that time, I would hope to see that type of AI governance. And Laurie's quite right to point to digital literacy in schools. I also think that policymakers need some digital literacy. For anybody who saw the TikTok hearing in the United States, it was pretty embarrassing that our senior political leadership doesn't understand how Wi-Fi works. And that if you log into a Wi-Fi network, yes, you are on the internet. I mean, there are a host of examples like that. But for me, that I don't say that because to shame members of Congress, but rather to point out that the most senior government officials are also still figuring this out, and we really need to catch up because the technology is moving faster than we are out there.
Thank you, Heather. That's very interesting. Just as a riff on that, I think you're identifying not just that there's, I suppose, that there's technological illiteracy, but also, I suppose, also what Laurie was talking about is about the ability to work out whether something smells right or not. Mm. And sorry to bang a drum here, but the famous historian Louis Namier famously said that history gives one a sense of how things do not happen. And when Laurie was talking about educating, the young, I thought if only there was a subject which would help them critically evaluate sources and work out whether something was credible or not, but we'll perhaps leave that for another time. We had a very good question from Saloni Utam along these lines as the speaker, just before the speaker started answering it. So thank you for that about deepfakes and language models. I'm just going to turn to my colleague, Dana Allen, who's the editor of Survival here and a senior fellow. And apologies because the text on my screen is tiny, so I can only read it as though it was small newsprint. So Dana said, many thanks to both speakers and thanks for a really fascinating book. I take your main message to be that bad actors can't easily change the narrative, but only tweak it. But do you agree there can be tactical level tweaks with great strategic effect? And he said, for example, Russian hacking and release of Clinton campaign and DNC emails, tweaking the narrative enough to sway some tens of thousands of votes in a few swing states to switch the election result, which was, after all, a binary choice. And events like this are, of course, overdetermined. And as Laurie said, it's a very difficult thing to measure. But likewise, you can't rule out a big strategic effect, can you? Heather, do you want to go first for that?
Sure. Just I think that's right. That sounds right. The other example that I would point to was the use of social media in Myanmar, where there were already those pre-existing religious and cultural tensions, but social media proved that social media was proven to have some effect in leading to genocide activities there. And I know that's still something under investigation. But just to say, it isn't just about politics, where these small tweaks can lead to much bigger scale effects. So yeah, I think that's a really valuable kind of additional point. I think I'll turn it over to Laurie because I see him nodding vigorously, which is always a good sign.
Yeah, I just want to add, of course, I mean, at the margins, all sorts of things can make a difference when things are tight. I mean, it's like in any conflict. You can give some extra military equipment to a belligerent, but if they're being overwhelmed, it won't make much difference. If it's very tight, it will. And so that's the case. And 2016 is the one that we keep on going back to, partly because I think there was a naivety around at the time. I don't think the issues were as well understood as they are now. You had, we describe this in the book, not only the hacking into democratic emails and then via WikiLeaks making them available, but you also had pretty fertile ground for suspicion of Hillary Clinton. And this was directed as much against Hillary Clinton as it was pro-Trump. So of course, I mean, nobody would suggest that in situations where a few votes matter, something that can get you a few votes will make a difference. But many things may get you those extra votes. And there's nothing new. I mean, as a historian, you would know there's an Oviev letter of the early 1920s, which was almost certainly a fake, but which persuaded many that the Labour Party was in the pay of the communists, or the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which is one of the greatest fakes of all time, which still gets sadly cited by anti-Semites. So you can't say that this stuff is irrelevant and has no impact. Again, I think it's proportion that we're going for, and perspective, rather than to dismiss it outright.
Thank you very much, Laurie and Heather, for those points. I've got a couple of questions which I'm going to group because they're largely, I think, along similar lines. So one from Dawood Azami, who's one of our associate fellows here. So thank you for the informative presentations and congratulations on your book. I'm looking forward to reading it. How do you see the information campaign by the US/UK? Are they engaged in somehow similar practices or strategies as the countries you mentioned? And how successful do you think they are? And secondly, how would you compare them with that of China and Russia? And just to group that with another one by Manuel Wabel, I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing that, from the Swiss Armed Forces. And they said, was the West primarily analyzed as the receiver of info ops or also as a transmitter? So a similar kind of thing. Laurie or Heather, please just answer in whichever order you prefer.
Well, I mean, I think the answer is it's different because I mean, we do occasionally have state-sponsored campaigns, information campaigns. During the counterinsurgency operations in Iraq and Afghanistan, narrative operations were seen to be a big thing. But their problem was actually the relevant audience was those who paid for them, rather than those who were supposed to be receiving them. And like all bureaucratic things of this sort, they weren't that impressive. However, Western media is seen to be an enormous threat by closed societies. Russia and China keep them out. And it's worth bearing in mind that from Putin's perspective, all his problems arose from the attraction of populations in the former Soviet Union, including in Russia, but certainly Ukraine, how they were attracted by Western ideas and mediums. There is one view, I'm not sure whether this made the book or not, that one of the reasons why he was so keen to get back in 2016 was the Panama Papers, which you may recall, which revealed all sorts of tax schemes and their beneficiaries, including a number close to Putin himself. So he didn't like it when it was applied to him. So I think ours are successful to the extent the press does its job, and our media does their job. And equally, a lot of the big problems in our societies, I'd argue, the Fox media may have more of an impact on American opinion, irrespective of what the Russians or anybody else was doing. And it was a source of its own distortions. But if the media is doing its job, then and this goes out, then it is notable the extent to which themes in the Western media are picked up and noticed, even in apparently closed societies. But it's different. It doesn't work so well with central state direction.
Yeah, I would just add to that. I think there's three things that really define US-UK approaches and particularly differentiate them. I mean, the first is it's on perhaps more on the US side. It's so domestically focused. Laurie mentioned Fox News. I don't think Fox News producers particularly care how that is seen outside of red and purple states in the United States. That's not their target audience. And so it's the domestic audiences really are the focus. The second thing is US and UK messaging and information efforts. It always seems to be it seems very much to be on the defensive. It seems to be much more focused at combating disinformation, about putting out intelligence. I think the EU has done a really great job at this. Like in a lot of the cases that we looked at, the countering disinformation effort came from an EU agency. But it does often seem that it is on the back foot. And that's part of the strategy, which is to kind of defend and go after the disinformation is part of the effort. And then the last kind of trait that I would say is that on the US side in particular, it seems that part of the narrative is trying to juxtapose us, the West, versus what Russia and China do. So they spread disinformation. They're pushing these lies. We are committed to transparency. We can see that juxtaposition in a host of issues. One challenge that I'm seeing folks in the US and in Washington kind of grapple with, though, is that we want to juxtapose it in such a way as to say, well, we're democracies, and democracies have freedom of the press, and democracies have transparency. But that democracy versus the West narrative is pretty hard to push right now. I think part of that is a legacy of Iraq. But I think that I'm hearing a lot more folks around Washington who are really leaning pretty hard into that side of the narrative. But I think for me, those are kind of the three things that really set them apart. It is the domestic focus, being on the defensive, and that juxtaposition.
Thank you very much, Heather and Laurie. I just want to kind of stay on this theme for a bit because I have at least one other question kind of playing on it. We had a question from Ben Barry, who's our ISS Senior Fellow for Land Warfare. He said, reversing the polarity, what advice would you, as the authors, have for the, quote, good actors? And I suppose what you're saying is that well, things are very defensive from our side, but I suppose that's the distinguishing factor is we don't do, how can I put it, at least consciously, disinformation programs or operations. I want to also kind of, he's absent, he was hoping to join the meeting, but has unfortunately been unable to, is Marcus Willett, who's our senior advisor for cyber operations and a former deputy head of GCHQ, and he has actually his own book in the series forthcoming in a few months, where he also thinks about some of the questions that you two have kind of have grappled with. And he draws a distinction between kind of information operations that are enabled by cyber techniques, which, for instance, he would oversee against Islamic State or whoever it was, our adversaries, which were generally speaking quite targeted, quite kind of narrowly focused, aimed at influencing or confusing individuals or small delineated groups of people for a strategic effect. Whereas if you look at Russia and China, but particularly Russia, it tends to be much more indiscriminate, and it's aimed at kind of at a societal level. And I suppose, he would look at, for instance, the late unlamented Prigozhin's IRA, which he set up some years ago, the Internet Research Agency, I think it is, to essentially spread online disinformation in ways to try and kind of seed that in foreign societies. And generally speaking, I think it's accepted that the UK and the US don't do that unless they're in a kind of, perhaps in the Second World War, we might have, if we're in a kind of situation of existential peril. But that's not a routine kind of part of our statecraft in peacetime. So I would say that's one distinguishing factor. But sorry to jump in, but I suppose, Heather and Laurie, is there anything you'd like to say about advice for good actors other than what you've already observed?
Yeah, I mean, just sort of on the general points, I mean, it's perfectly set. I mean, it's good to say there are different types of campaign. So an ISIS campaign, based on the fact that they were tearing through towns to pepper people who might be in the next town with images of what they had to expect. I mean, that can be powerful stuff. Or the major disinformation campaigns the Allies ran during the Second World War to persuade the Germans that the invasion was coming at Calais rather than Normandy. So I mean, these have got a very definite purpose and a very definite target audience as well, and therefore the more targeted you have to assume, the more effective they are. And it's probably also true that a lot of Russian activity is to cause confusion as much as to implant a particular view. As you get, all the anti-vaccination campaign, all we're doing is asking questions, but it's to throw doubt. What advice? I think there are some things that we've done that have been pretty good. And that would be in the use of intelligence. After the debacle of Iraq, the US and UK restored some of their credibility by the material they put out on the Russian invasion when the Russians were saying they weren't going to invade, and did raise consciousness of what was going to come, did ensure a debate happened. GCHQ has done a lot on cyber attacks and attribution. I think this is more not so much creating a whole storyline, which is what we tend to think of with narratives, but providing some basic information that is now reasonably authoritative, and forces other people to address that information, to deal with the debate. And so inevitably, as Heather said, a lot of stuff is going to be quite defensive, and there's nothing wrong with that, and it needs to be done. So if the Russians are telling stories about dirty bombs and so on, it's good to get in to say this isn't happening. So I think a lot of what governments can do is related to keeping the debate as informed as possible, and getting out information, including information that you may prefer never, you may prefer to keep quiet about, but it adds to credibility. Just a final word. I mean, the Ukrainian information campaign, narrative campaign, was very successful, because it had credibility, it had a great story, it appealed to the right values. Zelensky knew how to tailor his messages, but they can get into trouble when they seem to be claiming things that weren't happening, or pushing their luck and so on. So it's very hard to get these things right. I think reliability and credibility create trust, and part of that is actually being willing to talk about things that don't always reflect well on you, or aren't always the news you'd wish. That, I think, is always the test. I mean, sorry, I'm rambling a bit. Just to give one example, from the Falklands War, a lot of credibility was gained by the British MOD when they were the first to announce the attack on HMS Sheffield. In fact, the Argentinians might not even known they would have hit it if it wasn't for the fact that we announced it. And that, because we were prepared to talk about losses as well as gains, it just made it a more trustworthy source.
Thank you very
If
much.
I can just add one additional point to that, it's that in combating disinformation, we should also think about who are the audiences that we're targeting, because the intelligence sharing, I agree with Lori's, I think really is a way forward. Thus far, that's been really focused on allies and partners. And at some point, I do think that our efforts to combat disinformation, we have to do better about working with the global south, because that is a real focus of Russian and Chinese disinformation campaigns. And I think they're having a fair bit of success in some of these regions that we in the US and in the West have ignored for quite a while, to be frank. And targeting those regions, along with some military support, access to cheaper energy and resources, that could have a much more long-term strategic effect. And so when we share that intel, when we combat the disinformation, it shouldn't be just with the NATO allies in mind. It should also be with South Africa in mind.
Thank you very much, Heather. And I think you're absolutely right. And I think even Zelensky himself has kind of acknowledged that he's been much more successful in places like Europe or North America than he has in South America or Africa, for that matter. I want to turn to another question, which I suppose kind of touches on some of what we were talking about a bit earlier, from Tom McCain, formerly of the MOD, I believe, and now RUSI. And he asked, did Laurie and Heather consider the impact of cyber campaigns to affect the views of the targets? Do you think it will have a similarly limited impact on opinion? So over to you, however you'd like to interpret that term.
I mean, we distinguish at the start between cyber campaigns in the sense, I mean, if you go back to sort of old categories, you might talk about sabotage and propaganda and subversion. And cyber, I've always tended to see more in terms of the sabotage side of the equation rather than the propaganda and subversion, although from what you're saying before, one can also see ways in which there's an obvious overlap, especially with AI, in which cyber can facilitate the rapid transmission of lots of messages and so on. But I tend to think, so I think there is a similarity. Indeed, I think some of the work on cyber ops is similar to information ops in that it shows the difficulties of getting the timing right, that synchronizing attacks, of doing something which has a long-term impact. Obviously, if you break an important piece of infrastructure, then that has consequences. Although again, as the Russians have shown, sometimes it's easy to do that just by hitting them with high explosives rather than trying to play around with their software. So I think the issues are similar. To the extent I've got Tom's question right. These things, I think that there's a general point, which is when you're just throwing stuff out there through the networks, and it isn't very carefully targeted or has a rather narrow target, you can't really be sure of the effect. And one of the difficulties with cyber is because you don't know how much the target is aware of the risk, has sorted out its defenses, has got redundancies in their system or whatever. Even when you set it in motion, you're never quite sure what the effect is going to be. Or, as in some of the Russian cyber attacks, you start to hit far more than you ever intended to hit, including countries that you thought might be sympathetic, including your own country. I mean, we found that this happened with the information campaigns. They go to the wrong places, and they don't always create the right impressions.
Thanks, Laurie. Heather, do you want to add anything to that?
Only one point. I think an earlier version of this book, our title was "Twitter War Will Not Take Place," which was riffing off of Thomas Ridge's book "Cyber War Will Not Take Place." I think the title we ended up with is much better. But just to kind of reinforce, that was, in the earlier iterations of the project, that was a point we kept coming back to. So there were a lot of overlaps, but nothing else to add.
There's a question I'd like to pose in a bit about unintended consequences or perhaps even lucky escapes. But first, I have one from Saranaya G, who I believe is a student in India. And they've asked, as social media grew to be a great platform for a great range of countries to interact over a plethora of issues, where should we draw the line between freedom of speech and expression with a high probability of disinformation as a potential threat to national interest of a country, both in international relations and domestic political opinion? And how far should states involve themselves in regulating such platforms? Laurie, would you like to take the first crack at that?
I'll offer it to Heather. I'll offer it to Heather.
Okay, Heather, your go.
Wow, thanks. I don't know. I'm still thinking about this and grappling with it. And to be honest, when we finish this book, that's something I still think about a lot. I'm still grappling with. There's a few things I do think that should guide whatever direction we go. One of them is the basic, again, this is a very American kind of statement, so apologies. The kind of rule about free speech is you can say what you want, but you can't scream fire in a crowded movie. And that, to me, I think is a pretty good guidepost for when, where, and how we should be regulating a lot of what happens on social media. But at the moment, it does feel very ad hoc. There are cases here about where social media activity drives teenage suicide. How do you intervene on that? How do you regulate that? How do you regulate the use of social media that contributed to the January 6th attack here? And so again, it feels like at the moment it's very piecemeal, and we don't have a clear set of rules and guidelines for that. But the one that I keep coming back to is that we do need some sort of rule and regulation for that. I really do wish that the social media companies would engage in the sort of dialogue that we see the tech industry and AI engaging with about the need for governance. And don't get me wrong, the AI companies are not perfect either, but they just seem much more receptive to having the conversation and much more aware of the potential consequences of their technologies. And a great example of this was Mustafa Suleiman's recent book, and which a lot of that is about, well, here's how you should be thinking about and regulating AI. While recognizing, all the freedoms of speech and the way that it could make our lives better, but also using it in a responsible way. And I just haven't seen social media companies really engaging in that conversation. So maybe that's actually a second guardrail that I would put here, which is social media companies need to be part of that decision for where we draw the line. And can't just be passed down from on high. But like I said, I don't know the answer to that one. It's a really great question.
Yeah, I mean, I think, and Twitter's gone backwards. So stuff that would have been stopped before is now allowed. Indeed, is being retweeted by the owner. So it in the end, it undermines the value of the site. I think it is a difficult one, because every time you get too specific on this, you suddenly find you've cut out something that actually ought to be allowed. So which is a standard problem of regulation and law. It's not unique. Where is it safe to be vague? I think I understand why some people would always want to contribute anonymously, but if they're contributing anonymously, I don't think they should be abusive. And I think, I think there are basic values that make any conversation civil, that are worth emphasizing. And it used to be the case, but not so much anymore, that on Twitter the good stuff just drowned out the bad. I mean, it was there, but it was easy to ignore. There were simple ways of blocking and muting and so on, and people took advantage of that. So I think you can have a lot of self-regulation, but you need something fundamental in there that indicates the standards of the platform are going to be upheld. It's quite interesting, because I spend a lot of time on Substack these days, which is very different, because people have to make much more of a positive decision to engage with somebody. They even have to pay to engage with somebody who's posting their Substacks. And I think that helps quite a lot in making it effective. But obviously also means you just get through to fewer people. So, there's a trade-off there.
Thank you so much, Laurie and Heather. We have more interesting questions, but unfortunately we've got 30 seconds left of the seminar. So I'll wrap it up. I just would say one thing to add something Laurie said earlier. I suppose incitement to violence is usually quite a good line to draw on this, but this is not a new problem. He mentioned the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. The historian Norman Cohn estimated that by 1939, that was the second most distributed text in the world after the Bible. And he described that very aptly as a warrant for genocide. So obviously these kind of campaigns and lies do have very real and very terrible consequences. But however, I'd like to end on a more upbeat note, which is thank you so much, Laurie and Heather, for this excellent book. Thank you so much for all the work you put into it. I'm delighted that it's now out in the world and everyone has a chance to read it and think about it, agree and disagree with it. As I said, ISF members should have this or should be having it very shortly. It's available on Amazon, and you should also receive a code for 20% discount at Routledge. And after we disappear from your screens, you should see a QR code for a minute or two that we'll keep up there. Thank you so much, Heather and Laurie, for joining us. Thank you so much to everyone for joining us today. Thank you. Take care.
Thank you.